microscopic organisms that cause disease. So those are fungi, bacteria, viruses, water molds, nematodes, and sometimes we even classify parasitic plants in that group. Let me say, if anybody listening remembers anything today, is that the word disease refers to symptoms. So it's when the plant starts developing symptoms. That's what we describe as disease. And a lot of our plant disease names are descriptive for the symptoms that we see. Now that does not mean infection. Infection is the time that the pathogen actually infects the plant, and it can be hours sometimes, but it's usually days, weeks, sometimes months before we actually see disease. So be careful. So I talk pathogens, I throw the word pathogens around a lot. That's different than disease. Disease is the symptom. So think about when you've got a cold, or here we are in coronavirus, COVID-19 times. So you know there's that time between infection, then there's that incubation period, and then there's the time that you show symptoms. That's the same with our plant pathogens. So in terms of plant pathogens, again, they're microscopic. So we're always dealing with microscopic organisms. But today I promised to talk about fungi, and a really geeky term that you always hear plant pathologists say, it gets old but it kind of doesn't, is that if you study fungi, you're a pretty fun guy. So fungi are a huge group within our realm of plant pathogens. So a couple of things about fungi is that they're more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So they are eukaryotes. They're pretty ancient. The fossil record tells us that they're 460 million years old. So the first fungal fossils, 460 million years old. But we live in a time where we can use a lot of molecular techniques to look at things from the molecular, the DNA level. And our molecular data tells us that fungi might be more than 1 billion years old. So very old. They've been around for a very long time. And while they may appear pretty primitive, they can be pretty darn sophisticated, and they can really wreak havoc on those of us who are trying to keep them out of our gardens. So 1 billion years old, what is that in a context? Bacteria are about 3.5 billion years old. Plants only 425 million years old. So plants evolved much later than bacteria and fungi. So just a fun fact. So what about plant pathogens? So we're here to talk about plant disease. I promise you, we're going to talk about something more broad than that. We're just going to have some fun facts today. So there are a lot of fungi out there. What we do know is there's probably 1.5 billion fungal species out there. Only about 100,000 have been described. So there are a lot more that are yet in the pipeline. About 250,000 plant species, there are about 250,000 plant species. So that's a 6-fold difference in the number of fungal species out there versus the number of plant species out there. But back to fungi. So there are a lot of fungi, okay? 1.5 billion fungal species. All right, very few of those actually cause plant disease. A lot of them have other uses, other life cycles here. But when we do talk about plant diseases, about 85% of those are fungal. So we have a few that are bacterial, fewer that are viral. But most of our plant diseases are caused by fungi, but most fungi don't cause plant disease. All right, so here's another term, fungi. The true term, or fungi, see I have this one in quotes. So we use the term fungi very loosely. So when we do talk fungi, which one are you talking about? So in terms of true fungi, we're talking about the kingdom fungi. And that's usually, so when you talk to a geeky plant pathologist, we're going to be very specific. This is a true fungus. And that matters, and I'll tell you why later. There are some other groups of fungus-like pathogens or non-pathogens that are fungus-like. Those are the oomycetes or the water molds, for those of you who know Pythium and Phytophthora and downy mildew. Those are oomycetes. And so those are not true fungi. Then, of course, there are the slime molds. We'll take a look at some slime molds today. I have a few photos. And so slime molds are also not fungi. This really matters because as we start managing, so all of these fungi, in quotes, all of these fungus-like organisms, they act differently. They have different life cycles. They have different biochemical processes. So when we manage, we have to know those details. And to know if something is a true fungus versus, for instance, a water mold or oomycete, that really changes the way we manage or whether we manage at all. Slime molds, for instance, we don't manage slime molds. So, so we have to know those technical things. And sometimes the technical things are fun. If you're like me, they're always fun. But seriously, there's a difference. So fungi versus fungus-like, or you can put it in quotes. All right, what do fungi eat? Well, they're heterotrophic. That means that they get their food from other sources, like us. Plants, on the other hand, make their own food. Fungi do not make their own food. They have to get it from somewhere else. So we can kind of classify them. So fungi can decompose already dead things. They can parasitize or serve as pathogens and kill things, or they can serve as symbionts. So symbiotic relationships mean that some fungi, for instance, will have a symbiotic relationship with algae. And so they'll utilize the photosynthetic byproducts from the algae, and then they will get their food source there without damaging the algae or the host. So back to some geeky terminology, let's look at a couple of these. So fungi can be biotrophic, meaning that they get their nutrients and their energies, their carbon sources from living plants. So they're not killing the plant, they're getting it from a living plant. And the image I have here is powdery mildew on hemp. Powdery mildew doesn't kill plants, so that is not its intent. So it's getting its resources from the plant, but it doesn't go as far as killing the plant. So those are biotrophs. Necrotroph, on the other hand, has to kill plant cells before it can consume it. So it's kind of like a two-part wham bam. So it'll kill cells, consume those cells. So that's usually when we're looking at, for instance, a lot of times at canker or some leaf spots, you'll see, we always tell you that the fungus is running ahead of the dead plant tissue. And that's what's happening. The fungus is running ahead, killing, and then those that go behind it are consuming. So it's a two-part life cycle, or a two-part series in what's happening. And then, of course, this is where most fungi fit in as saprotrophs. And so saprophytes, they eat or consume materials that are already dead, okay? They're your decomposers in the forest. They're the ones, the bird nest fungi, that are consuming the mulch in your garden beds. So they're not doing anything. We can call them beneficial by all means. Sometimes they're pretty neutral. So they're consuming what's already been killed by some other means. And that's where a lot of our fungi do fit in. Okay, so here's just some fun things. So we want to talk about fun fungi. This is one that we call entomopathogens or entomopathogenic fungi. Entomo means insect, so these parasitize and consume insects. So some really common ones you may see on the Discovery Channel or the Nature Channel, or for instance, the zombie ants. So these fungi will invade these ants. The ants will continue to move around until the fungus actually will start to sporulate and to send out spores. So that's the image on the bottom. So just some fun things. So if you really want to get creative today, just Google entomopathogens or entomopathogenic fungi, and there's some really cool things out there. Overall, though, what we do know as plant scientists or as agriculture scientists is that we can use these kinds of beneficial fungi as biocontrol agents. So there are a lot of these entomopathogenic fungi that have been processed and packaged and then being sold to serve as biological control for certain insects. So that's just a fun fact for the day. All right. Fungi can also be animal parasites, and it's not often that we see fungi as animal parasites. There are only kind of a handful of examples in the grand scheme of things, but when we do see them, they're pretty bad. So white nose fungus of bats, we all know this one, right? We've been to Mammoth Cave, we've been to any of our state parks. We are walking through a disinfestant, a foot bath, and that's so we're not carrying the white nose fungus in and out of caves. So very important fungus, and one that really is wreaking havoc on our ecosystem. One of the most famous ones probably is the frog killer fungus, and that is a fungus that is actually consumes the skin of frogs, and so that's probably one of the ones that you'll see more in the headlines, or especially in the recent past, we saw that one more in the headlines. Yeast, or yeast infections as we call them, those that infect humans. So our yeast are fungi, so that can be anything from nail fungus to diaper rash. So candida, or yeast infection, so that is fungal. Histomoplasmosis, and that's a respiratory fungus. Aspergillus, so there are some human and animal parasites that are noteworthy, absolutely noteworthy, but we just don't see them as much as we see the saprophytes and the plant pathogens. All right, now let's talk about plant diseases, which of course is my favorite topic. So plant diseases in general, again, I have lots of pictures here from different areas, but plant diseases, there's some pretty basic concepts, and that's what we're talking about today, that kind of apply to all situations. So I have some cool pictures, but if you grow only vegetables, or if you grow only fruit, or only ornamentals, you can apply a lot of these concepts there. And definitely jot down any questions you have. We're going to go through a Q&A at the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about any of these. So plant diseases remember, plant diseases are the symptoms caused by microscopic plant pathogens. Today we're talking about fungi, but those symptoms can be leaf spots, molds and mildews, cankers, wood rots, and root rots. We can twist those words any way we want. As long as our descriptor is correct, we are okay. So let's break those down. Let's look at them one at a time and just say, I want to say a few words about each one. So leaf spots. Leaf spots are what everyone sees, right? You see symptoms on your leaves before you're going to see symptoms on the internal vascular system of a plant, or before you'll see it in your roots, right? That's pretty much common sense. But leaf spots, as we describe them, is when a fungal or other pathogen infects the leaf, and then that fungus runs ahead. Usually they're killing plant cells, and then that plant death is kind of running behind it. And usually in the center of those, we'll see some kind of spore production or something. So leaf spots, sometimes they matter, sometimes they don't. There are a lot of leaf spots out there. Look at any plant, and I doubt you'll ever see perfect leaves. But when do those leaf spots matter? Which ones are the most important? Which ones are the least important? That's why you have to be in touch with your county agent. You have to attend these types of webinars. I'm not going into specifics today, but which one you have matters. So from your eyes, you're looking at a very general, all leaf spots look alike kind of thing. And yes, they often do. But when you get to the nitty gritty, it's the specific fungus. And of course, that's a microscopy issue a lot of times. But knowing which fungus is there, we can tell you what happens next. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how leaf spots, where leaf spots come from, and how they survive, what that life cycle is. So in short, these leaves typically will fall to the ground just like any diseased leaf. Sometimes if it's minor enough, they'll hang around for most of the season. Other times they'll turn necrotic or yellow really quickly and drop really quickly. But either way, they fall to the ground, and that's where they're going to overwinter. So within this fungal life cycle, there's going to be some type of survival structure. And that survival structure is intent on making it through the hot, dry summer, making it through a cold winter, making it through a dormant season, UV resistance, fungicide resistance. There are a lot of layers to the protections that these fungi have evolved to develop. They've developed, and so the next spring, just as the weather gets warm and of course it's wet, it's Kentucky spring, then those structures will release spores, and spores will back up into the canopy of whatever the plant is, whether it's a perennial shrub tree, and then infection occurs. So that's kind of that life cycle in general. And I'm generalizing everything today. We definitely need to break some of these parts into specific webinars. But today it's just kind of like a general overview. Okay, so another disease type are the molds and mildews. And that is a bit of a descriptor for saying that we're actually looking at the fungus. Okay, whereas the leaf spot, we were looking at dead plant tissue. With molds and mildews, we're actually looking at the fungus. There's so much of it that this microscopic pathogen is suddenly not microscopic anymore. This is powdery mildew. Botrytis gray mold is another one that's pretty common. Brown rot on peach, the fuzziness. So anytime if you have a loaf of bread on your cabinet, it gets fuzzy in there. So that's when we start seeing, we call those either molds or mildews. And we'll usually see those, and typically they're not necrotrophs. Typically on a plant, your powdery mildews, for example, they rarely kill plants. And if they do, the plant is actually succumbing to the pressure. But the fungi's intent is not to kill the plant. So that's what mold and mildew means. All right. And then there are cankers. This is always a fun topic when we start talking about woody canker. Cankers simply means a woody lesion. So a lesion, what would be the equivalent of a leaf spot happening on woody tissue, usually happening from the outside. So when it's happening from the outside, you will see that canker very clearly on the outside. Sometimes you'll see here we're callousing over. So cankers are usually fungal cankers. Think about, let's backtrack a little bit. So think about a fungal spore that you've probably never seen because they're microscopic, right? How can something so fragile and so small actually penetrate something as tough and hard as tree bark? That is where we talk about wounding a lot. So to prevent wounding, we'll prevent any, I call them open doors for these fungi to get in. So the fungi have to get in some way. It can be a bad pruning cut, it can be insect borer, it can be, this is string trimmer damage right here, voles, sun scald. So a lot of things can actually wound trees, and when they wound, that's when the fungi get in. So a lot of your cankering pathogens are opportunistic. So that's the word we use. Opportunistic means they're waiting for the open door so they can go in and have a seat at the all-you-can-eat buffet. Once they're in, there's no managing them. And so overwintering occurs inside the plant, and then when it's warm and rainy, the fungus will send out whatever the sporulation structures or the capsules or the survival structures. It'll send those out to the surface so they can be windblown or rain splashed to a neighboring healthy tree. Okay. Then we can talk about wood rots. This is an internal rot. This is the wrong image for an internal rot. My apologies. So when I talk about wood rot, I'm talking about an internal rot. They'll typically get in the same way, but you usually won't see what's happening on the outside until you'll start seeing mushrooms or bracket fungi poking out from the side. That's an indication of an internal wood rot. Those are just different fungi. They pretty much get in the same way. Microscopic holes, bad pruning cuts, etc. So wood rot's much the same as the cankering, except they're going to be internal, and a lot of times you don't see them until a storm comes through and the tree breaks. All right, and finally, root rots. Root rots are exactly what I said they are. It's rotting roots. Now, very few of us ever check out the roots on our plants. It would only take a crazy plant pathologist to dig up every plant to see what the roots look like, but, but root rots really do occur. They occur really often, and I really wish that our stakeholders would do a lot more digging, especially when they start seeing plants not so healthy. So your root rotting fungi and our oomycetes, by the way, are common root rotters. But today we're talking about fungi. They will infect the root, and then after that they can just move on up the root, down the root, depending on what the particular fungus is. The trick here is that we don't see rotten roots, of course, right? Because they're underground. So what we're going to see is stunting, poor plant health, sometimes yellowing. If it's really hot out, we're going to see wilting because we don't have enough root structure left to keep up with that upper plant part's needs. So they're not going to be pumping through enough water through a drought, enough nutrients for a growing plant. And that's what we're going to see in the upper plant parts. So while we see a plant that's just not so healthy, we always must consider the root system. A lot of times, if I will be kind of deliberating and we're trying to figure out what's wrong with this plant, I will usually ask you to look at the growth scars, particularly on a tree. How much has this tree grown, not just this year, not just last year, but maybe for the last 3 to 5 years. So if we see those growth scars very close together, that means that tree, for instance, is not growing rapidly and hasn't for a while. That's going to indicate that there's something bigger wrong there. Now, of course, you can have just root issues. You can have poor soil health. You can have compacted soil. You can have a lot of things going on that are not specifically fungal root rots, but a lot of times fungal root rots or root rots period will go in when there is root damage or root stress. So a lot of times if you wait too long, we're going to see them coming in at the same time, or by the time they get to us, we have more than one situation and we've got to tease out which was first, the chicken or the egg. And sometimes that's hard to do when there's a lot of underground stressors occurring. Okay. So let's move on to some that are not plant pathogens. Remember, I talked about biotrophs, necrotrophs, and saprotrophs. So let's talk about saprobes just a little bit. Saprobes are the decomposers. They're the ones that are on the forest floor. They're in our mulch. This is bird nests. No, this is not. This is artillery fungus. Ooh. So your saprobes are decomposing things that are already dead. And when that happens, you are just seeing the fruiting structures. You're seeing the sporulation. You're going to see the mushrooms. So you are seeing the fruiting structure, but there's a whole lot of fungus there that you're not seeing. So sometimes when people see mushrooms in their lawn or different mushroom structures in their landscape, they kind of panic and they want to get rid of them, but there's a lot more fungus down there, and it's beneficial. It's a sign of high organic matter. So it's a sign of good things, except the artillery fungus. So artillery fungus can be a nuisance. So we have a new publication, by the way, on mulch fungi. So I will, at the very end, I will put a link to that for anybody who wants it. And I will definitely, agents that have just gotten their hands on that one, so it'll probably be going out in newsletters, etc. And then, so another saprobe, a group of saprobes, I have to mention slime molds. Slime molds are not fungi, but we have to mention them because they're usually so cool. Not a day goes by that I don't get an image of dog vomit fungus or dog vomit slime mold. So it really looks like dog vomit in your flower beds. And it's another one of these slime molds that is just colonizing mulch. It's breaking down mulch, puff balls. So there are a lot of different, I'm going blank. So just a lot of different slime molds we see. And again, our publication has some of those, but I'm telling you, not a day goes by this time of year that we don't see dog vomit fungus. So I thought that would be something that everyone must leave with a new word, a new techie term, dog vomit. All right, so let's get back to our plant diseases, because that's what we're supposed to be here for anyway. And let's talk a little bit about their life cycles. Now, every plant pathogen has a different life cycle. Some of them we lump together and we generalize descriptions. Others are very specific. So I'm just going to kind of talk about plant pathogens or plant pathogenic fungi overall right now. And I'm giving you a visual, and this one has been around forever. And I still think it's the best descriptor of how disease occurs. Now remember, disease is the symptom. So in order to have disease, it's like having a triangle, right? You have to have 3 sides of the triangle if you're going to have a triangle. And to have disease, you have to have 3 things. You have to have the pathogen. Okay, the plant pathogen has to be there. You can't have powdery mildew if you don't have the powdery mildew fungus. You can have symptoms that might be similar, but you're not going to have that plant disease. All right, you have to have a susceptible host. And to have a susceptible host, sometimes that means it's species specific. Sometimes it's a plant tissue type. A root rot has to have a root, right? Sometimes certain fungi will infect only fruit, or sometimes they will infect only new emerging leaves. So you have to have a susceptible host or host plant part. And finally, you have to have a conducive environment. So this is the one that we should control more than we really do. And by environment, the 2 things that a plant pathogen needs to complete its life cycle is free water, moderate temperatures. By free water, that can mean irrigation, and or it can mean rain, of course. It can mean poorly drained soil, it can mean fog, it can mean humidity. Sometimes the north side of a building is more humid than, for instance, the south side. If you have microclimates, like morning sun will dry things off, will dry the dew off of plants more quickly than if you have morning shade. So that's an environmental component that we can manage. And moderate temperature, that's one that we can semi-manage. And by moderate temperature, I mean, if you're comfortable, the fungus is typically comfortable. If you're too cold, it's too cold. If you're too hot, it's too hot. So in those extreme conditions, fungi don't die, by the way. They just go into a dormancy type state. But when they're in those ideal temperatures, those moderate temperature ranges, they are growing, they are sporulating, they are infecting, and that life cycle is really going. So we can manage. So think about hot summer, right? So as our temperatures are hitting that 80 and 85 degree mark, our fungi are shutting down. They're not liking it. So we don't have a lot of active fungal pathogens in summertime, unless it's cloudy for extended periods. We have, for instance, one of these tropical storms that come through and give us a few days of just kind of cloudy and sprinkling rain, those kinds of things. That makes a difference. But in terms of management, we can alter those environments, right? We can prune to let the sun in, and that'll get things hotter. It'll change the dynamic of a microclimate if we let the sun in, or if we let the morning sun hit, etc. Spacing plants, orienting plants, pruning to increase air circulation and to let the sunshine in. All of that is a way to manipulate the environment. So let's go back through the disease triangle one more time, because I really want this to be the take home for anybody who deals with plant diseases. Host plant, you can manage plant diseases by managing your host. You can choose resistant cultivars. You can do a lot of things. You can keep things pruned or not. You can make sure that you have got the right plant in the right place. So you can manage it through that host component. Through the pathogen component, you can prune, you can have a good sanitation program, and you can make sure you're buying clean, healthy plants. Don't buy those on the clearance rack at certain stores that have them on sale. It's not a bargain to buy a diseased plant. So you can prune out, and you can use fungicides. That's limited. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or you can manipulate your environment. I say or. and you can manipulate your environment, especially drying things out. So breaking one leg of the disease triangle, in theory, eliminates disease. You can't have disease without 3 parts. It's hard to do all of them 100%, but if you take some time to try to address all 3, you can really manage a lot of plant diseases very well by using cultural practices and not needing fungicides, particularly in home landscapes. Now, when you get into, for instance, commercial orchards, that's a different story. I assume I'm not talking to commercial growers right now. Commercial fruit production is a different story. Let me say that. But if you are home gardening, you've got that diversity and you can definitely do this. All right, so I talked about survival earlier. I want to touch on it again. Fungi overwinter, okay? Very few of them move in new every year. They usually survive, they overwinter, and they do that through special structures. This is black rot on grapes. See those little dots that look like black pepper flakes in that rotted grape berry? Those are called pycnidia. They are capsules that are full of spores, 30 to 60 spores in one of those capsules. You can't see the spore, but you can definitely see the pycnidium. And so my point here is, look how many there are. Now imagine if an entire cluster of grape was infected, or an entire row of grapes in your garden. Imagine if that is happening, okay? And if each one of those capsules, see how it's black and melanized, it's UV resistant, it's cold resistant, it's heat and drought resistant. And that is how fungi make their way from one season to the next. And as we let disease go, those numbers increase from year to year. So we've got to manage our diseases. We've got to keep them down, and we've got to prevent them from overwintering. So when we talk about sanitation, we really mean it. And sanitation can be a whole nother webinar series. Very important, but I just want to say that as we go through, and there are some links on our website that you can take a look at some of those if you care to. All right, so management, I'm still talking about management. Number one question, does this disease need to be managed? A lot of times they don't. A lot of times we're diversified enough. We don't need to manage them at all. Anthracnose in shade trees, that's probably my biggest call this time of year. We don't need to manage it. But when we do need to manage, think of how we're going to manage. Cultural practices first. What can we do with our hands? We can manage water. We can manage humidity. We can manage runoff. Sanitation, that should have been number one. I need to swap those two. Sanitation is my favorite soapbox. Clean it up, get it out. Don't throw it to the ground. Get it out of there. Using resistant cultivars when those are available. Yeah, we have a few resistant cultivars available for ornamentals. Most of our resistance lies in vegetables, but there are some fruit as well. So if you have a problem, we'll probably be discussing with you possible resistant cultivars. And rotation. Sometimes if you have a buildup of a specific pathogen in a specific location or flower bed or garden row, sometimes you have to rotate out of susceptible host and go in with something that's not susceptible and do a rotation. And finally, the last thing on my list is fungicides. So fungicides are not your first option. And if you don't do everything above, it's no use having a fungicide regime at all. And we use fungicides as preventatives. Fungicides are not curatives. Remember that. You can't wait till you're devastated with disease to use fungicides. Fungicides are going to protect new foliage or new fruit or uninfected plant parts. Once a plant part is infected, you've got to go back through and use sanitation and prune, or sometimes rogue, throw things away, and then protect the new plants or the new foliage. So that's key. If we're talking about fruit crops, again, we have to have that conversation separately. But a lot of times when we have a landscape beds or a diversified garden, we're going to have a lot of things going on. We're not going to have that monoculture. And without the monoculture, we usually don't have the severity that we would in, for instance, a commercial agricultural setting. Okay. And Consider, again, you probably don't need to manage disease, or you can do it very simply with things like pruning. So always consider the potential or the possibility of not managing disease at all if you do see disease. Never mention, try to manage things like saprophytes. They're good. So don't let them excite you. And remember that everything you do in your garden affects other things, not just beneficial insects. I've got the ladybug here, but beneficial fungi as well. Fungicide is a lot of times going to kill both your plant pathogen and all of those saprobes or all those beneficial fungi, and that's not something you want to do. All right, so in closing, I just want to remind everybody that this is totally an overview. This is totally just an example of what we've got on our website, and that there are specifics that a lot of times you have to hone in if you have a particular problem. I can't generalize everything, definitely not in an intro, but we have a lot of good things on our website. So our website, I'm going to post in the comments in a minute once I close this out. It's plantpathology.ca, which means College of Agriculture, .uky.edu. Okay, so plantpathology.ca.uky.edu. And if you go to our publications tab or our extension tab, you'll see all these subtopics by commodity, and you can just keep scrolling down. And we have lots of publications and descriptions and pictures for you. I mentioned the mulch fungi. This is our new one, so I'm talking about it, and it's there on the left. It is on our page. All right. And finally, know your county agent, work with your county agent. There are a lot of things going on through your county offices. So definitely utilize your extension resources. If a plant disease needs to come to our diagnostic lab, not everything does. If it does, your county agent can help you get it to our diagnostic lab. And then once you go to our website, you'll see links to lots of social media sites, Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest, Kentucky Pest News newsletter, Fruit Facts newsletter. So we have a lot of resources there for you to consider. You'll get alerts, those kinds of things. So consider all the resources that are out there. You'll be surprised what you can learn from others and from timely updates. Okay, so with that, I will take questions.